Good morning and welcome to this panel at the Paris Forum. I'm sure many of you have been here for a long time, so you know how this works. Looking forward to a very engaging discussion on a topic of great importance, which is topics of human rights and human rights defenders. For those of you who are not familiar, on the screens you'll see what channel you need to be on if you need to listen to this in French or in English. But let me start with a few words on what the topic we're going to be exploring today and then introduce you to our panelists. This year marks 70 years since the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, 20 years since the Declaration on the Human Rights Defenders. And it's been a long period, and we can obviously focus on everything that has not gone right. And we'll be talking today about the fact that in many countries, human rights are not being respected, and that we're facing serious headwinds today, whether it's the rise of illiberalism, whether it's the fact that so many countries now are focusing in transactional politics, focusing on issues that are very close to home but don't really have an impact or have a negative impact on human rights abroad, whether it's trying to curb migration or to fight terrorism or what is often called terrorism at all costs. You have some countries that are focused so much that they're beginning to relativize the question of human rights. Even countries like the one that we are in right now, which has been under this president a defender of human rights when it has come to the recent tragic murder of Jamal Khashoggi, said, well, we have to be careful not to allow an issue like that to complicate our relations with a sovereign state with which we have important relations. So we're seeing these headwinds, we're seeing the rise of populism, we're seeing the rise of nativism, we're seeing an erosion of norms that we could see in countries like Syria or Myanmar, or even in countries closer to home, where, again, the erosion of norms, erosion of the respect for human rights, threats to human rights defenders are present for all to see. But I don't only want this to be a session on everything that's going wrong or everything that still needs to be achieved, but also to take a look back at what progress has been made over the last 70 and 20 years and try to understand why that progress has been made, what are the ingredients that have allowed that progress to be made, and how to protect it, and then to look at the challenges that are still there and how to overcome them, and in the spirit of the forum, not to stare at the problem, but to think of practical solutions. And to do that, we have three very fantastic panel we have today to discuss this. People who've been in the trenches, who've been at the forefront, who sometimes have suffered for the actions that they've taken. And so I want to introduce them, and then we will turn to the presentation of a specific project, and again, in the spirit of the forum, a project about how to defend human rights defenders. So let me start with Ankana Nelapajit, who's Thailand National Commissioner for Human Rights, and who, of course, will talk to us about the situation in her own country, but more broadly, and your experience in terms of your struggle to defend human rights and the defenders of human rights. Bruno Stagno, who is with us from Executive Director of Human Rights Watch, obviously one of the organizations at the forefront that has done the most to protect, defend, and not least Andrew Anderson, who's the Executive Director of Frontline Defenders, and who will be talking to us about the specific project that you've presented here to the forum. So maybe we could start with that, Andrew, and you could have a few minutes to tell us about your project and about how it's already achieved some of the goals that you've set for it.
Good morning. Yes, thank you very much for the kind words of introduction, and it's our honour as Frontline Defenders to be one of the board members of protectdefenders.eu, and we have a rotating chair of the board, which we currently hold, so it's our pleasure to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about that project here this morning. The protectdefenders.eu is an EU-funded human rights defenders mechanism that was set up 3 years ago to provide practical support to human rights defenders at risk around the world. It's a consortium composed of 12 international and regional human rights organizations who have networks around the world working on the issue of human rights defenders in many different forms. Organizations working on women human rights defenders, on LGBTI rights defenders, on defenders working on land rights and environmental rights, as well as those working more generally on the subject of the protection of human rights defenders. And because we have that strong network around the world, we've been able to deliver practical support to those most at risk. We've delivered grants to 1,100 human rights defenders for emergency support. Some of those grants are provided within 48 hours to those people who are most at risk. For example, we've just delivered grants to 8 LGBTI rights defenders in Tanzania who are needing to find safe places to hide in the midst of the current crackdown that's being promoted by the government and one of the regional governors in Tanzania at the moment. We've provided funding for temporary relocation for 380 human rights defenders over the last 3 years. And it's important to say that 2/3 of the over 11,000 beneficiaries belong to particularly targeted groups, including those defending the rights of women, LGBTI, land, environment, and also particularly rural human rights defenders. One of the things we've been trying to do is make sure that we are able to provide support to human rights defenders who are not working in the capital cities, who are not already well connected to international human rights organizations, who are often those who are most targeted and most vulnerable. And over the course of the last 3 years, we've provided 8.1 million euros in support. And that's a big number and a big statistic, but it's really about providing as immediate and practical support as possible to people when they most need help. And by doing that, hopefully enabling human rights defenders under attack to be more resilient, to be able to sustain their work, to be able to continue to work to achieve justice and to defend the rights of the communities they work on behalf of.
Thank you, and that's a good segue, and then I want to come back and see whether there are any comments on that project. But it's, even listening to you talking about LGBTI rights, women's rights, environmental activist rights, that is already a snapshot of the progress that's been made, some of the issues that were not at the forefront 70 years ago, even 20 years ago, which have now become part of the international norms of what needs to be protected, what needs to be defended. So I want to use that, and in some ways the crackdown that we're experiencing today, or the attempts to silence these voices, is a tribute to the fact that those voices are now more heard. And we were discussing it privately earlier, that you have more defenders of human rights than you've ever had before. You have more activism than you've had before. You have people using social media more than they have before. All of that has triggered some of the responses, which is trying to crack down on those voices and trying to use social media to undo the progress that's made. So Bruno, if I could turn to you, since obviously you have a global perspective on the status of human rights around the world. If we want to start on a semi-positive note, because there'll be enough depressing notes as we continue the conversation, how do you look at it, if in the grand sweep of things over the last several decades, what progress do you see has been made, and what have been the main tools that have allowed that?
So I think there's no doubt that if you consider the arc of history over the past 70 years, today we have the largest portion of the world's population that is fairer, freer, that is living healthier, better, longer lives than ever before. So, and that is, I think, a direct result in part not only of a number of instruments that have been adopted in the international community, but more concretely of the 27 rights that are enshrined in the Universal Declaration for Human Rights. I think that's undeniable. We have had a tremendous also positive arc of history in terms of accountability, with the establishment in the 90s of what were known as the ad hoc international tribunals for Rwanda and also for the former Yugoslavia, which were really threshold moments, game changers of sorts, of course dedicated to very specific mass atrocity crime situations. The establishment in 1998 and 2002, the actual coming into being of the International Criminal Court, which some people obviously might have issues with, and yes, part of the promise of the ICC still has to deliver, but it still is a remarkable achievement by the international community. There's still issues, of course, pertaining to its universality, but it's still, I think, very positive work coming forward. The fact that even in situations as dire as Syria or as Myanmar, which have attracted a lot of media attention, there are basically two unsung heroes here in terms of accountability. It hasn't attracted media attention, but we have today international mechanisms that are preparing case-ready files to be presented to a future international court or to a national court or some type of hybrid court in terms of the violations being committed in Syria and also in Myanmar by all parties. So I think that there is a lot to be hopeful for. There is a lot to be proud of. But we are, of course, at a very difficult moment, a geopolitical moment that actually transcends human rights. It's a very dire geopolitical moment. And what we need is a reinforcement of moral courage and of a political audacity and creativity by those that want to defend the values and principles of the world that we have constructed as an international community that believes that the safety of one is the safety of all.
So thank you. And I want to come back to the question of how to, how to instill that moral courage and how that moral courage could actually translate into change on the ground. But just to press you a little bit, the progress that's been made, if you had to think of what were the, is it the arc of history that just bends towards progress, as President Obama used to say, or is it something about the form of activism or mechanisms in specific states? And I'll turn to you, Kana, in a second. What do you view as having been the most effective tools for protecting and then enshrining these rights?
Yeah, so I don't want to believe that just, history has been kind to us. No, at every one of these critical moments, it has been because we have had leaders and states that have had the audacity to lift beyond what is the minimum common denominator, to have civil society that has been moving behind. So things like, the interdiction of landmines, the International Criminal Court, the Human Rights Defenders Convention, all of this is because you have engaged public citizens supporting those states that want to be courageous and lead. So it is the conjunction between states that want to move forward, that want to show that audacity, but also a civil society that is engaged and that wants to understand that we need to build better and larger global public goods. And that's the only way in order to find the peace and stability and also the rights for for all human beings that we all crave for.
Thank you. So, Ankana, turning to you and with the same question and your own experience, which is slightly different, and maybe you want to say a little bit about it, what you've been doing in Thailand. How do you look at the progress over the recent period or the longer period, whether it's in your country or in Southeast Asia more broadly? And again, what do you think have been the main tools that have achieved the progress that we have achieved? And of course, we'll have to turn to the progress that we haven't achieved.
Thank you very much. As women human rights defenders, I think that now human rights defenders faces a lot of problems. I think in the past years, a lot of human rights defenders were killed or disappeared, and they have no further investigation, and especially in country. I think it's very challenging for the role of human rights defenders. And for myself, as a Commissioner, National Human Rights Commission, Thailand, I think that the human rights institutions have very critical roles to play to protect the human rights defenders. From my experiences, I think that in many countries, maybe the state officer mostly think that human rights defenders, like the person who received the money from abroad and try to attack our countries. But if we look at the human rights defenders on the ground, we will see that most of the affected community now, they change themselves to be the defenders, and they try to protect their land rights, national resources, because now we have really a lot of big projects, and it's affected to the people and to the community as well. One thing I think is important is now we have a lot of, after we have Human Rights Declaration, and all countries ratify the International Convention, ICCPR, ESCR, CEDAW, even in Convention Against Torture. And we receive a lot of recommendations from the UN, and also the UPR mechanism give a lot of recommendations to all countries. and I think that many countries accepted the recommendations of the UPR to protect human rights defenders. For example, in my country, Thailand, they have around 10 recommendations on human rights defenders. So that how can the state follow what the UPR recommendations and have the concrete solution to protect human rights defenders. I think, as I mentioned earlier, that human rights defenders in the past they faced a lot of intimidation or harassment, but now the situation changed. A lot of human rights defenders face this judicial harassment. So many of the human rights defenders, they might be prosecuted more than 10 cases. In every day, they have to spend their life by going to the court every day. And for women human rights defenders, it's affected a lot to their daily life. For women, they have their children, they have to take care of their family. By the way, they have to earn more money to go to the court. Even though, for example, in Thailand, we have the justice bail. We have the justice fund to allow people to access for bail. But when the human rights defenders were prosecuted, 5, 6, or 7, or more than 10, the justice fund have not enough money to support the people. So I think this is some kind of new harassment. And also another thing I want to highlight is about online attack to human rights defenders. Now there's a lot of online attack to human rights defenders and a lot of hate speech. So I think that it's the responsibility of the state to protect the human rights defenders, not to allow the online attack. Maybe in all countries, I think that we need to have the law to protect human rights defenders, not allow everybody to prosecute the human rights defenders with easily. And other thing I want to highlight is I think that democracy is very important, because if we have no democracy, people have no right to speak out. And when they cannot speak out, or they cannot anti some project that affected to the communities, many of them were arrested because they have very limited freedom of expression. They cannot speak what they want. They can organize some peaceful protest. I'm threatened that is the peaceful protest that people must allow to act. Yes.
Thank you. I don't know, Andrew, if you want to jump in on any of this, and obviously the issue of defending human rights activists, but if you want to say one more word on the positive side, because then I have a lot on the less positive side.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's important to recognize that there are more human rights defenders doing more good work in more places than ever before. When you look 20 years ago, we had a big conference of human rights defenders here in Paris, the first World Summit of Human Rights Defenders. And there were many countries where it was impossible. It was not safe to bring human rights defenders from, and or it was very difficult to work for human rights in those countries. We just had, a week ago, a second World Summit of Human Rights Defenders, and we had 153 defenders from 105 countries. There could have been many more countries, because there are human rights defenders working on a wide array of issues in nearly every country on the planet, and those people are making a difference. That's why there is this concerted backlash against human rights activism. Governments and populist leaders and other powerful institutions know that it's local people working to defend and advance their human rights who make a difference, whether it's on land rights or women's rights or LGBTI rights. And those things are advancing. If we look globally at the issue of women's rights or LGBTI rights, we see a very well coordinated and funded backlash on those issues. We see homophobic hate campaigns, etc., being used by populist leaders in a number of places, often for reasons to divert attention from their own corruption or authoritarianism. But part of the reason they're doing that is because there is an advance. There are more people supporting equality, tolerance, pluralism. There's big advances in terms of women's rights. Still a long, long way to go in many countries. And often those advances achieved at a high price, with killings of human rights defenders, very bad attacks on human rights defenders. But human rights is a contest. It's not something that comes down from the powerful as some kind of benevolence. Human rights has always been about power and accountability, about equality and discrimination. It's about mobilizing people at the local level to achieve progress, to achieve change, to press leaders to implement laws that protect human rights, to make advances in terms of equality and inclusion. And we're winning that battle. We're facing some defeats. We're facing a big backlash. The bad guys are more organized and are putting more resources into the pushback against human rights than ever before. The governments who are supposed to be the good guys, the democratic governments, are weaker on human rights than they were. But overall, the human rights movement at the local level, at the grassroots level, has never been stronger or more robust. And that's why we're making progress.
Thanks. I think that is one message to take away from this session already, which is that for all of the setbacks, the situation is probably stronger or more established, or the defense and the norms of human rights are more established than they've been. But I do want to now look at the challenges and think of concrete ways of overcoming them. So if I look at everything that you've said so far, whether it's sort of international conventions or institutions, it's hard to imagine today, given where we are, that we're going to get more progress in international consensus on forms of accountability or norms of human rights, just because of the state of the world today, which you referred to, which goes beyond human rights. At the state level, I think you are seeing, if some years ago the norm was democracy and human rights, that was sort of the lingua franca, that's the currency that people used, whether they applied it or not, but that's what they felt was their entry ticket. Countries felt was their entry ticket to a legitimate place in the arena of nations. Today it's very different, and you see it country after country reverting to forms of populism, nationalism, nativism, anti-liberalism, anti-globalism, which is often defined in different ways, but all of which produces a much more hostile environment to the struggles that you are engaged in. And again, one could list the countries who do face impunity, and whether it's Syria, Russia, Myanmar, Turkey, Venezuela. I mean, we can go down the list. Even countries that are closer to our own, to Western world, whether it's Poland, Hungary, or whether it's Israel, et cetera, and whether it's the United States and the president who says that the media is the enemy of the people. All of these are different gradations. They're not all the same, but they do create an atmosphere. So if there is less appetite for international sort of consensus on how to move these norms forward, at the level of states there's also a greater pushback, and if holding countries accountable, people, what is the instrument? Sanctioning countries, and people view their commercial and transactional interests involved. It does leave so much of the onus on individual activists, civil society, non-government organizations. So in that environment, turn to you again, Bruno. How do you counter these challenges, and what do you think needs to happen so that you could flip the narrative?
Well, there is no one single solution, of course. It has to be done on a case-by-case basis. But I think that in many of the situations that you mentioned, be it Venezuela, sure, it's a dire situation, but after all, there has been, for example, a joint referral by a number of countries within the region of the situation in Venezuela to the International Criminal Court. That is a very important marker. You mentioned Syria. Liechtenstein led a remarkable and very courageous initiative in the General Assembly of the United Nations to establish something that is today fully operational, which is known as the International Independent Impartial Mechanism, which is looking into war crimes committed by all parties in Syria. Myanmar, there has been now a replication of that very same mechanism I just mentioned regarding Syria for Myanmar, against, obviously, the will of Myanmar and China, as you can imagine. How was it done? Through the Human Rights Council, to skirt the Security Council, where you presumably would have gotten a veto. If you look into, so I can go down the list, and presumably in all of them, we can find an accountability mechanism that we have been able to somehow fashion to respond to that case-specific situation. And what you need, you mentioned sanctions. Sanctions, I think, are a very significant tool. They must not be cast aside. I'm not talking about generalized sanctions that would apply to and have unintended impacts on civilians. We're talking about very targeted sanctions against those who make decisions regarding the targeting of civilians or for very serious human rights violations against civilians. So these are basically the generals in Myanmar. These are basically those who lead the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. Those are, for example, those that lead the war in Syria. So targeted sanctions, that means freezing their bank accounts, putting travel bans on them. I think they can be quite significant tools, not used alone, but in conjunction with other tools that are available. And finally, I would say you need the moral courage. You mentioned the democracies that no longer are finding this moral courage. They need to find it. And what's interesting is that as London and Washington and Paris have been losing, and the Scandinavians have been losing some of the moral outrage they had in the past, what you're seeing is actually small and medium-sized countries that don't have as significant commercial and political implications in some of these conflicts who are basically leading the charge. As I mentioned, it was Liechtenstein on Syria. It's the Netherlands on Yemen. So this is the way forward. It's Iceland on the Philippines. These are very interesting examples of countries that are finding the moral outrage and courage to lead the international community to put the onus of accountability on those who are committing the most serious violations.
So a question for any of you, and just to play devil's advocate, I think people would say there's sort of a crisis in both of those tools that you mentioned, the tool of accountability. First of all, there's, as you mentioned, the crisis of legitimacy of the ICC and the notion that it is not unbiased, whether that's true or not, and that it's often victor's justice. The fact that it doesn't really produce results. You could hold countries, you could create this institution hasn't changed their behavior. That's even more so on the case of sanctions, which has become the tool of first, second, and third resort. When people don't want to do something else, they resort to sanctions. At least some countries do. And I'm curious, are there cases that you could point to where sanctions have worked to improve a human rights situation? And if so, what made them work? Again, any of you, if you want to speak about either instruments of accountability or sanctions, concrete cases where those have worked and what circumstances lend themselves to positive results. Please.
Well, just on the issue of sanctions, we saw in Sudan in the last year that when President Obama in one of his last acts lifted sanctions on Sudan, and that lifting was temporary for 6 months, and much to our surprise, in June last year, the US decided not to automatically wave through the lifting of those sanctions, and that led to human rights defenders being released inside Sudan, including Dr. Mudawi Ibrahim Adam, one of the human rights defenders whose cases we were taking up and pressing on. He was one of those who was being released. His organisation, the Sudan Social Development Organisation, is in the process of being allowed to operate again inside Sudan. That's because of the pressure related to the sanctions and the fact that the US was not waving through the lifting of them. There's also been at least a little bit of action on reducing the level of violence in Darfur. So, you know, there's plenty of examples where sanctions have not been so brilliantly implemented and or they've been implemented for a short period of time and then lifted when there's been no real progress. We saw that with the EU and Uzbekistan a number of years ago, where the Uzbeks increased the number of human rights defenders in prison at the moment that the EU lifted the sanctions. So there's lots of poor examples too, but there's no doubt in my mind that they can be an effective measure when they're used in a targeted way and when governments have the backbone to stick to the principles that led them to impose the sanctions in the first place.
Anyone else want to come in on this?
I totally agree with what Andrew has said. Obviously, we can have a long debate about sanctions and the utility of sanctions, but what's indispensable is to have them properly implemented. They should lead to a change in behavior. And one of the problems that we see traditionally is that the sanctions are not necessarily coordinated between the unilateral sanctions imposed by states, the multilateral sanctions imposed, say, by the EU or the United Nations, and, for example, those that have been identified as the main perpetrators. Just very quickly, for example, on Darfur, on the genocide in Darfur. It's very interesting to see that the 7 individuals that have been primarily targeted by the International Criminal Court as those who are primarily responsible for the situation in Darfur, none of them have been targeted by the United Nations Security Council. Those that are targeted are actually 4 other individuals who presumably are not the most responsible. So, of course, the sanctions are not going to work if you're not targeting the right people. So that's where you need the moral courage to also put the sanctions that will hurt those who are making the decisions.
So if I could ask you, Ankana, since you actually, you were in your own country, you were fighting for human rights, what role did outside players play that you found most useful in your own struggles?
I think that the international communities can have like sanction, and not only sanction, but they should have the good recommendation to the countries as well. I think political will is very important. I think in each country they have to have the political will to protect their own population, their own citizen, and it is the responsibility of state to protect all of their people, all of the person who living in that state. I think the international communities can give recommendation and can support whatever, but I think the problem must be solved in each country. For my experiences, I think that if they have no political will, maybe some of the human rights defenders was killed or disappeared. And if the state have no political will to investigate, to have seriously investigation, even though you have the recommendation or even though you have sanctioned by other international communities, they have nothing changed. But I think that, by the way, international community can sanction for something, and they should have the recommendation. And I think that as the member of the United Nations, I think all countries must respect it to the obligation what they have promised. One thing I think is a problem is that for the implementation. I think when we ratify a lot of conventions, and how can we have the organic law that comply with the international law? So I think this is very important. And how can the people can use the international law when they were prosecuted to protect their own rights? I think this is very important. And you know that for the recommendation from the UN committee or the UPR, it cannot enforce it. But I think it's the state obligation to do what they promise. And I think what's important as myself as a women human rights defenders, I think the most important is in all nations all nations have to respect the role of human rights defenders. I think this is very important. They must not think that human rights defenders is the enemy. Not think that human rights defenders is only the person who want to attack the government. I think if we talk with the human rights defenders, we will see that we have a lot of human rights defenders, and we increase. Some states may think that if someone disappear, the problem will disappear, but it's not true. Maybe when somebody will killed or disappear, they will have more and more people stand up to protect human rights. So I think that this is for myself now as a human rights commission. I think the critical role of human rights institution in all the country is the mandate to protect the human rights defenders and to investigate all the cases and to give the smart recommendation to the state, to the cabinet, how the state can protect human rights defenders. I think we have now we celebrate the 20 years of Human Rights Defenders Declaration, but how can it implemented in the organic law in each country? I think this is a very important issues.
But so from your experience dealing with authorities in your country or other countries, I mean, that argument, obviously it's a moral argument. It's not clear why it would have much resonance with leaders in a country for whom they do see human rights activists as a threat. You could invoke moral or even practical considerations, but what have you found to be the most effective way of getting them to change their behavior? Is it, the tools that we've heard, it's civil society activism, it's international condemnation, sanctions, accountability, or it's trying to persuade government officials in the country itself? How could that be done when clearly they're pursuing these policies because they think it's in their interest?
For my experiences now, I think that the people, they have their network and they work together. And I think that if they have their strong network working together, so that they can give the recommendation to the government as well, and they can try to protect themselves. By the way, I think that for Thailand, for my country, we got a lot of recommendation from the UN or from the international communities, the EU as well. But we failed. I think we failed to protect the human rights defenders. We have no organic law. We have no regulation to protect human rights defenders. So I think what I'm doing is working with the people, with the human rights defenders, and I think that now they are really courage, and I have a good opportunity to meet a lot of women human rights defenders as well. I think now we have a lot of problem about business and human rights. When we talk about business, we have a lot of big industrial. We have a lot of investment. By the way, a lot of people lost their land, and a lot of people are affected by some factory. Some people have lead poisoning in their blood. They have some seriously disease. So I think this is very important. Sometimes we can use the Global Compact on Human Rights Defenders to the Global Compact on Business and Human Rights, and we should use this to protect the human rights defenders as well. And I want to focus about the gender lens. I think gender is very important because we should include gender in the cross-cutting in everything. And I think that for myself, my experience, I investigate a lot of cases of human rights defenders, and I think it's very suffering when human rights defenders face the intimidation. Some women human rights defenders face sexual harassment, and nobody cares. And they can, I think that they have no law to protect, they have no law to guarantee that people can exercise their freedom of expression, how people can talk directly to their own government, what happened to them, what they are concerned, what affect to their communities. I think we have to concentrate and to open our mind, and we have to change our mindset also. I think maybe in many countries they have really bad attitude toward human rights defenders. As I mentioned earlier, they mostly think that human rights defenders want to attack the government or want to anti the development, but in reality, it's not true.
Thank you. We're going to soon open it up to questions, but I'd like to ask each one of you to answer one more, is to think about sort of personal story or personal story to your organization of something where you think your activities, the activities of your organization has made a difference, a positive difference, as a lesson for how we could go forward. If I could just start with you again, Bruno, then we'll go to the next two. Something, one specific case where you think Human Rights Watch or some personal story made a difference.
So maybe just to return to what I mentioned regarding Syria, because it's been such a hopeless scenario where there has been such a dereliction of duty by the international community. This new mechanism that was established, this independent, impartial international mechanism that is already preparing case-ready files in terms of serious violations committed by all parties in this conflict in Syria. this is a game changer potentially. This is a UN-based mechanism established by the General Assembly. So it was basically a recognition that the Security Council had failed in its duty to protect civilians in Syria. The General Assembly stepping in, led by the smallest of nations you could imagine, Liechtenstein, which basically puts to shame the international community and all the powers that be, that they did not have the collective courage to do this. It was a huge political lift for Liechtenstein. Human Rights Watch was, of course, working very closely behind with Liechtenstein. And this passed by 110 votes in the General Assembly. What happened on the day of the adoption of this mechanism was that Russia sent a letter to the Secretary General saying that the General Assembly had overstepped its mandate and basically betrayed the United Nations Charter. I think no letter could actually speak to the importance of this mechanism more than the very fact that Russia was doing a démarche on the Secretary General. And thanks to this, we now have these case-ready files that are being prepared. And as I mentioned, this mechanism now can be replicated elsewhere, precisely to reach those regions of the world where the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court cannot reach because the states are not party to the Rome Statute, or because of the lack of courage within the Security Council to refer a situation to the International Criminal Court. So I think that was one of our organization's proudest moments. This happened in 2016, and as I mentioned, now it has been replicated in Myanmar in 2018 through the Human Rights Council.
Thank you. Andrew.
Let me give you a more individual or personal story. Claudia Duque is a journalist and woman human rights defender in Colombia. Almost 20 years ago, her friend and colleague, also journalist Jaime Garzón, was murdered. She took up his case, she wrote about his case, she campaigned for the people who were responsible for killing him to be brought to justice. She faced death threats, she faced threats against her daughter, and one of the good points about the need to protect human rights defenders is about the specific and additional risks women human rights defenders also face. 3 times she had to leave the country and then went back in spite of the threats that she faced. We provided emergency relocation support. We provided support for security in her office, a reinforced steel door in her home. She also benefited from protection from others, including from the Colombian state protection program that provided her with a armored car for a while. But she persisted. She continued working alongside others over almost 20 years. And this summer, the senior intelligence official in Colombia who was responsible for that murder was finally convicted. And it's a story of hope. There are too many human rights defenders who have been killed in Colombia, and it's not a country that's going in a good direction at the moment. The level of killings of human rights defenders is increasing. But it shows that when the right constellation of support can come in and to support the human rights defenders, they can eventually achieve justice. And that gives us hope going forward, both for the situation in Colombia, but also more broadly that practical measures to support the security and protection of those fighting for justice does make a difference. And it's human rights defenders working at the local and national level who will, in the end, make a difference in achieving justice. But the international community can do more to support them, to help them to persevere in that struggle.
And of course, your project is one of those ways of both defending people and one for which I know you have EU assistance, but maybe others can help to achieve the same goal.
Always.
I got anything personal from your own experience, and of course, you've been very personally involved, and your family's been personally involved. Something where you saw the power of individuals or of civil society achieving a result.
I'm very humble to raise my own case for myself. My husband, he's the human rights lawyer, and he helped a lot of people all over the country who were violated by the state officer. And on 12th of March 2004, he was abducted by the police, and he disappeared until now. On the way of my struggle for human rights, I found that it's really difficult for an ordinary woman or ordinary people to fight for human rights. I spent 12 years in the court on the disappearance of my husband. And at the end, I'm lost. The Supreme Court acquitted the case and nobody found guilty. And during the past 14 years, I often receive threats, even death threat. And it's not happened only to me, but it's happened in a lot of human rights defenders. So I think that this is very important. I not want to speak like case by case, but we should look at like holistic to solve our problem. It's like that when some people disappear or killed, they have no investigation. Maybe some have some investigation but have no strong evidence. And at the end, nobody found guilty. So it's happened again and again. If we want to stop this kind of intimidation and harassment to human rights defenders, I think we need the political will. I think the state have obligation to protect all the people. And I think that for the role of human rights defenders and women human rights defenders, it's not like myself, no. You know that I'm very high profile, but I want to mention about a lot of human rights defenders, especially women, some of them are indigenous people, some of them are the local people in the remote area. So they live in fear. And I think that each state must protect all the people. In the past year, we often ask the state to have the regulation or to have some mechanism to protect the human rights defenders. We need the concrete. We need the concrete solution. It's not as the verbal. It's like that we try to protect everybody, but in reality, it's not true. The intimidation and harassment often happen every day, and the perpetrators walk freely. So this is what has happened nowadays. My recommendation is I like to see that in all nations, respect the role of human rights defenders and have sincerity to protect the human rights defenders, not seeing that human rights defenders is like their enemy, not seeing that human rights defenders want to attack the country or other people. I think we have to have more sincerity when talking about this.
Thank you. So I think I'm going to quickly wrap up, then we'll open it up to the audience. I mean, I think it's a message of resilience, of a movement that has sort of a storied history and has actually achieved quite a bit, but is facing sort of rowing against the current right now, and a current that is, for all the reasons that we've explored, but through support for civil society, support for the defenders of human rights, or defending the defenders of human rights, preserving evidence, accountability, creative means. I mean, you mentioned Myanmar, but there's also the ICC has also shown creativity in that case as well. Targeted sanctions, and again, one could have a debate about the effectiveness, but I think the cases that were mentioned are cases where sanctions were either threatened or the lifting of sanctions was clearly associated to steps that a country like Sudan could take. So some optimism, but of course no, far from being complacent given the situation we face today. And I want to thank you for your efforts, but open it up to questions. You could raise your hand and you'll be identified. You could also send questions through, which I get on my iPad through some mysterious mechanism, but I will take... I take 1 and 2. I'll take a few of them, 1 and 2, and then we'll answer those.
Hi, my name is Emin Husseinov. I'm exile-based human rights activist. And when you ask about examples, I just want to say for sometimes UN member states like Switzerland, when they want, they're able to save the human rights defenders. And especially in my case, the Swiss embassy in Azerbaijan hosted me when the government wanted to arrest me, and I've spent 1 year in Swiss embassy, and after Swiss leadership bring me out for Azerbaijan. But it's only single cases like mine. Maybe this happened from last 25 years in the post-Soviet area, in some African state, in Latin America. But my question to all participants, how we seriously able to help to human rights defenders which is staying on the front line? Because the will, which is colleague says, for dictatorships never have the will to change anything. And I'm not optimist for government like mine or in somebody in Turkmenistan or Uzbekistan finds the political will, because people which has stolen billions from his nations, they never find the will to going for a clear way. And how to all stakeholders, like multi-stakeholders initiative, able to really change? Because even in my case, I'm able to escape, but it's only single case. But many my colleagues, my brothers still in the prison, people which has helped me to escape, they killed in Azerbaijan 1 year later. And today, when I look to my colleague in Azerbaijan, EU or UN still didn't find solutions from human rights defenders which is want to continue his actions. They leave them alone. They're staying without funds. This government change the environment, don't provide any kind of possibilities to receive donations, nothing. Just we are completely destroyed. And now the trends going on in different countries. How global leaderships and with civil society able to change? Because now I think for it's many of you representative of the civil societies and nobody from governments participate in the panel. Maybe. Thanks.
Thank you, and thank you for that question. I'll ask if people could keep the questions relatively short so we could get as many as possible. So number 2.
In French, thank you. Alors, je vous remercie pour
so maybe
cette
if you give a
parole.
second for those who don't speak French to put their mics on, their headsets on. Could you give just 1 second? If you all speak French, do you all understand French? Do you want so maybe you need to put the this on. Sorry.
Thank you.
And then if somebody could tell her what number, what channel. Channel 1 for English. Okay, that's good. Thank you. Please.
Merci. Alors, moi, je viens du Congo-Brazzaville, où nous vivons depuis près de 40 ans une dictature féroce. Et tout à l'heure, vous avez parlé de la défense des droits des hommes, des droits humains. C'était un rapport de force. Alors, la question que je me pose aujourd'hui, pourquoi ne pas initier, comme dans le cadre du chapitre 7 du Conseil de sécurité, où il y a, quand il y a la menace à la sécurité internationale, on applique le chapitre 7. Alors pourquoi ne pas initier ce genre de chapitre pour la défense des droits humains dans le cadre de la violation flagrante des droits humains? Je me dis, pourquoi on ne peut pas aller dans ce sens-là? Parce qu'au Congo-Brazzaville, nous luttons depuis des années contre une dictature qui bombarde la population civile, qui affame. Et aujourd'hui, c'est un pays qui vit comme... C'est une prison à ciel ouvert. Donc on tue, celui qui est au pouvoir tue comme il veut. Et d'ailleurs, il a été invité à l'ouverture du forum sur la paix à Paris. Donc ça nous a tous étonnés que ça soit ça. Et nous, on est là, on n'arrête pas de se battre pour qu'il y ait une alternance démocratique. Parce que sans alternance, il n'y a pas de paix, il n'y a pas de développement. Et ça, il faut le dire, surtout en Afrique centrale. Donc nous avons un monde qui avance. En fait, chacun, c'est plus l'Occident qui avance dans les droits humains, la défense des droits humains. Donc on aimerait bien aussi qu'en Afrique, surtout en Afrique francophone, et c'est ce que je dénonce ici, c'est surtout en Afrique centrale que M. Macron qui initie ce forum de paix, qu'ils reçoivent des dictateurs qui, eux, mettent le désordre chez eux, qu'il n'y a pas de paix, qu'il n'y a pas des droits humains qui sont respectés au Congo-Brazzaville. Donc c'est pourquoi ne pas instaurer la charte comme le chapitre 7 du Conseil de sécurité ou de la charte des Nations Unies qui prévoit l'intervention justement par la force en cas de violation flagrante de la sécurité. Voilà ce que je voulais dire ici. Merci de m'avoir accordé la parole.
Maybe we'll take one more, number 7, and then you'll answer them.
I had a question because you talked about the problem of accountability and especially the power and the will of states. I was just wondering, who do you think or who can be capable to enforce the verdicts taken by the ICC? And if not states who are sometimes incapable or unwilling, do you think that a global police force or prison would be the solution to actually make these people accountable?
So 3 questions which actually go more or less in the same direction, which is how do you convince states? Are there means, international means, whether it's somewhat like a Chapter 7 or some international mechanism? So whoever wants to take this first, I'll turn to all 3 of you, but go ahead.
Sure, I guess I'll start in inverse order. So on the ICC, one of the misfortunes of the ICC is that you have many states that obviously have ratified the Rome Statute, but they're not living up to their commitment to cooperate with the court. And that's where we've had failures. Many significant states parties that are not arresting people who visit. South Africa, for example, comes to mind. A Security Council that has referred 2 situations, Darfur and Libya, and yet then is unwilling to cooperate with the prosecutor of the ICC, thereby basically in dereliction of its duties, the Security Council. So what we need is basically a reconfirmation of the Rome Statute spirit. That means that basically those that have signed up to this statute will cooperate with the court. And I must say that I think we have found probably the best rallying cry we could, because the new National Security Advisor of the U.S., Mr. John Bolton, has taken it almost as a personal crusade to deride the court. And in his coming out speech as National Security Advisor, he said that the International Criminal Court represented the greatest threat to the United States. It was such an over-exaggeration, of course, that what it has done is that it has really rallied support for the court. And we're starting to see support for the court, public and private, in ways that we did not see over many years past, because basically what we needed was basically somebody to really challenge the existence of this court. So thank you, Mr. John Bolton, for doing this. On Chapter 7, I take your point about Chapter 7, and of course it's a very intricate part of the UN Charter. What we were talking about, the targeted sanctions, fall within Chapter 7. I don't think we necessarily want to have military interventions. Military interventions are not necessarily the best solution. Many times military interventions actually lead to a lot of unintended consequences. Think of Libya. But I do think that there is a need, of course, for the Security Council, since you specifically asked about Chapter 7, to address a lot more situations that are not on its agenda. It has been extremely poor in doing early warning and prevention and in bringing issues to the attention of the Security Council more aggressively. And this is, I think, not only the responsibility of the Security Council, but also of specific members. And in this sense, France plays a key role. It is obviously a permanent member. It has a certain right of oversight over Francophone Africa, or at least it pretends to, since it's the pen holder on all African issues, Francophone African issues on the Security Council. But let's not forget that there are other possibilities. The Secretary General of the United Nations can also bring situations to the attention of the Security Council via what is known as Article 99. So he can also tell the Security Council what it needs to know and not what it wants to hear. So all of these are mechanisms that I think are useful. And I'll leave the specific case of Azerbaijan. You're obviously better versed than I. But I do think that what we need is more multilateral opprobrium on those leaders who basically want to host mega events, sporting or singing events, as Azerbaijan has done in the past, in a way of burnishing its credentials as a country that is open for business and open for investment, when in fact what it's doing to its own civil society is basically to crush it. And that we do not need, especially the Council of Europe and especially the European Union, to play into the hands of those that want to present open for business but closed to civil society.
Yeah, I'd like to first of all say it's great to see Amin here. I think one of the challenges in terms of Azerbaijan, in addition to what Bruno was saying, is that a number of donors who are working there and in some other countries where restrictive legislation has been brought in to try and stop support for human rights defenders on the ground have pulled out, both government donors, the EU itself, as well as some private foundations. And the really important thing is to continue to provide support, practical support to human rights defenders on the front line when they are under attack. One of the things that Khadija Ismailova, another brave human rights defender from Azerbaijan, said when we had a meeting with some of the donors during the crackdown was that if you disappear when our human rights defenders are in prison, and their families need resources to keep them alive in prison, to be able to get them food and medical treatment that they need, then how do you expect the human rights movement to be resilient and to be able to push back against this backlash? And I do think there is a challenge to the international community to be stronger in finding creative ways to get practical support to people when they are at immediate threat. And it was great that the Swiss were able to help in your individual case, but I think we need more action, and especially by some of the European governments in pushing back on some of that. And I'd also like to just mention, in terms of Congo, Brazzaville, and it links to what Bruno was saying. You know, we live in a governments. We need to have relations with authoritarian governments. We can't live in isolation from them. But we don't need to roll out the red carpet for dictators either. And I really think that democratic governments need to take a look at themselves and how they engage with some of the most brutal and repressive leaders around the world. We're not saying never speak to them or never engage with them. But the pictures that we too often see of kings from the Gulf or dictators from Congo, Brazzaville, or other repressive people having the red carpet rolled out for them shows a lack of moral courage, a lack of backbone on the side of those who should be stronger in defense of human rights and democracy.
Thank you. Do you have any answers to these?
I agree that without democracy, we cannot have peace. But for democracy in all countries, I think that the most important is that how we have how each country have the security sector reform. I mean, we need police reform, military reform, or judicial system reform, so that people can easily access to justice, and we can have people can have their own network. They can have freedom of expression. I think this is important, and I do believe in people power, and I think that when people come together, and I think with the support from the international communities, I think it will help. I think it's very sad if maybe human rights defenders receive a threat and they cannot stay in their own country. They have to escape, to stay, to live like the asylum seeker in other countries. But I think that the most important is how each state can, they have the obligation to protect their own population. I think this is very important, and I think the donors and also the international community should have recommendation to all the states to follow the UN guidelines and all the international convention as well.
Thank you. Let me take the next round. We'll go 7, 8, and 1, and then we'll come to you. That's the next round. Sorry. Go ahead.
Je fais suite à Madame la Commissaire pour juste rappeler que nous sommes à 70 ans de la DUDH. L'article 28 de la DUDH prône une responsabilité collective, notre responsabilité collective à la mise en place d'un environnement favorable au respect de la DUDH. Je veux parler de la Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme. Mais vous voyez, c'est souvent difficile. Elle a tout le temps martelé la question concernant la volonté politique. C'est souvent difficile pour un défenseur des droits de l'homme d'être dans un pays où la veille ou quelques jours avant, le Parlement vote une loi de restriction de l'espace civique et dans le même temps, vous voyez l'Union européenne ou bien vous voyez le PNUD signer un accord sur 3 ans, 4 ans à hauteur de millions de dollars avec lui. Vous posez la question de savoir si vraiment cette coopération internationale ou bien cette responsabilité collective qui doit mettre en place un environnement favorable pour le respect des droits de l'homme est vraiment une réalité. Je ne veux pas insister sur le défaut en fait d'efficacité des mécanismes parce que les mécanismes sont de très hauts mécanismes au niveau onusien. Je veux parler de l'examen périodique universel. un mécanisme sur lequel j'ai tout le temps travaillé dans mon pays. Mais c'est difficile de comprendre que le cadre de coopération internationale ne s'appuie pas en fait sur les recommandations qui sont faites pour avoir un agenda de coopération tant politique, économique que sociale avec ce pays. C'est un peu tout comme si ensemble on s'accorde, on convient d'instruments et de mécanismes sur lesquels, quand il s'agit, au lieu de faire une démocratie, au lieu de faire une diplomatie de valeurs et de principes, on constate tout simplement que c'est en fait une diplomatie de dollars et d'euros. Tout simplement. Donc, très sincèrement, je sais que dans tous nos pays, aujourd'hui, avec les contraintes que nous vivons, les défenseurs des droits de l'homme, franchement, sont motivés, ils sont engagés, mais il faut faire attention à ne pas vraiment émousser le ardeur. La réalité politique, la réalité géopolitique autour de nous n'est pas de nature à motiver, et nous sommes vraiment désespérés. Merci.
Merci.
Hi, good morning. Congo Felix Agbo from Cameroon. I want to start by thanking everybody on the panel and acknowledge the wonderful support that the international community, especially international organizations, have given human rights defenders in Cameroon in particular. I was a victim of the human rights atrocities by my government, arrested on the 17th of January 2017 for peaceful protests by the English-speaking lawyers, and I was charged on 7 counts of terrorism, incitement of civil war, group rebellion, secession, amongst others. But the pressure of frontline defenders, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and International Crisis Group ensured that after 8 months, the president signed a decree to release me. But we are not only looking at those who supposedly might be high profile. My former boss in the human rights section of the UN, Ms. Nora, who is here also, they did a lot. But there are more than 1,000 others who were arrested with me who, as we speak, they are still in jail. Because there is a thin line between the 2014 anti-terrorism law and the fight for human rights. So it is easy, this meeting that we are having here today, if you look at the 2014 law, Article 11, it would amount to terrorism. So everybody who can criticize or can dissent with the government would be tried for terrorism. So I think there is a need for the international community to put more pressure on these governments, not just for those who might be high profile, but just like Anderson of Frontline Defenders said, there should be measures put in place to protect those, especially in the rural areas, who are doing an enormous job, but they might not have the profile like those who are based in the city center. And we are going through a very difficult situation in Cameroon. It has never happened. If you look at the Central African region, the lady said she's from the Congo Brazzaville. Cameroon is supposedly the state that is not the most viable in the area. So if Cameroon goes down, Central Africa, Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, Chad, and Congo Brazzaville goes down. But the situation which is happening in Cameroon, where at least 140 villages have been burnt, a kind of collective punishment against the Anglophones, 1,000 in jail and more than 4,000 have been killed, 500,000 internally displaced and 50,000 as refugees in Nigeria. It doesn't really get, you know, the mainstream media. I don't know whether everybody wants us to get to the Darfur situation, whether it must be a genocide because there's an argument that it's a war crime or crimes against humanity. Does it need to meet the threshold of a genocide before we need the international community? So I want to seize this opportunity to urge the eminent panelists and everybody who is a friend of international justice, who is a friend to ensure that, I mean, countries don't fall into more problems, that we need to speak out against what is happening in Cameroon. The English-speaking and the French-speaking Cameroonians are going through a lot. And if care is not taken, International Crisis Group is of the opinion that we are not in a civil war. I also think that we're not yet in a civil war. But if care is not taken, Cameroon will slide into a civil war. Thank you.
Bonjour, je pose une question en français. Si la personne... je peux?
Oui, allez-y.
Ok, merci. Bouchaïb Jioui, je suis de l'Initiative européenne pour le développement et l'inclusion sociale. Je remercie mon collègue du Cameroun parce que vraiment, ma question est dans la continuité de ce qu'il vient de dire. Tous les conflits que vous avez cités tout à l'heure sont des conflits pratiquement, soit au Yémen, en Israël, au Cameroun, en Azerbaïdjan, sont des conflits qui concernent tout simplement la diversité des expressions culturelles. On a des pouvoirs qui rejettent et qui refusent la diversité des expressions culturelles. Ce matin, il y a eu un débat sur la question de l'immigration. Il a pris un peu une tournure qui ne m'a pas du tout plu. On a posé l'immigration et les immigrés comme un problème. Et on a penché vraiment... Toute la réflexion était sur comment régler ce problème-là, voilà, et comment les inclure, etc. Et on n'a jamais posé la question du rôle et de la place de la société d'accueil, notamment en Europe, et leur capacité à inclure les immigrés, enfin les demandeurs d'asile notamment. Et cette capacité est pratiquement nulle, tout simplement parce qu'il y a un problème au niveau de l'acceptation du principe de la diversité culturelle. La question est la suivante. Est-ce qu'on peut concevoir demain de poser le principe de protection et de défense de la diversité culturelle comme une norme impérative, un jus cogens, dans le sens vraiment de l'article 53 de la Convention de Vienne de 69. Sincèrement, je ne pense pas que le Conseil de sécurité, les membres permanents des conseils de sécurité seraient d'accord pour cela. Et je ne pense pas que, pour le dire à notre ami Bruno de Human Rights Watch, que Liechtenstein serait d'accord aussi pour aller dans ce sens. Alors que c'est l'évidence, tous les problèmes que vous avez soulevés, le Cameroun, la Somalie, le Yémen aujourd'hui qui est massacré, qui est bombardé, c'est une question tout simplement de droit, d'expression culturelle qui est rejetée, refusée par des nations, que ce soit l'Arabie Saoudite, que ce soit Israël, que ce soit des dictateurs dans tel ou tel pays africain. Est-ce qu'on peut concevoir demain, par exemple au niveau de l'Assemblée générale de l'ONU ou au Conseil de sécurité, de poser la question de la défense, la protection de la diversité culturelle comme étant une norme impérative, un jus cogens. Voilà, question très simple. Merci.
Okay, so why don't we take these three, and there's a question we just heard about protecting cultural diversity, but the other two also had to do with dilemmas that I think we need to face. One is, again, how do you balance, the gentleman asked how do you balance what you said was the need to continue to engage countries even when they are violators of human rights and make sure that if they need economic assistance or if the civil populations need humanitarian assistance, you don't want to punish them for the actions of their leaders. So how do you make that distinction of keeping the pressure but without punishing the people, which is you started to get into that. And the other one is the question we heard. Obviously, there's a whole issue of Cameroon which you could get into, but also the issue of sometimes countries will use high-profile cases to conceal sort of the more structural problems. And one could think of one example after another where attention is on one high-profile case, the government releases that person and then hopes that the attention will fade away. So how do you balance, and you mentioned the high-profile case in Colombia, how do you balance that focus, which almost gives an out to regimes that could say, okay, let's address this one. So again, why don't we start in the other order? Maybe you want to start off anything on any of the questions that you heard that you would like to comment on.
I think it's very challenging because now we celebrate 7 years Human Rights Declaration. By the way, there's many challenges happen in the world as we discuss about the migration situation of migration, and also it's increased the extremism all over the world. And also, I think that maybe the tolerance of people is reduced. Sometimes we cannot tolerate to diversity. We cannot tolerate to some religions or practices, and this make this cause the situation of violence also. I want to bring all this to the role of human rights defenders. I think that for myself, I think one thing we need is the clear definition of human rights defenders. If we not have the clear, we have the definition of human rights defenders in the EU guideline or UN, but in law. or constitution of our country do not have the clear definition. So that in many countries, they're not respected the rights of the human rights defenders. So I think this is very important. I think the most challenges is how we can implement it. How we can implement the law, and about the discretion of the law, how can we interpret the discretion of the law to be like to positive and to protect the people. I want to say something more about the extremists. I think now it's happened in many countries, especially the religious extremists. Human rights defenders who work on the LGBT or women's rights often face the death threat when they protect the rights of the LGBT person. So I think this is very important that we have to talk more on this, and I think that we have to work together. That how can we have some mechanism to protect, and I think it's very challenges. Many people talking every day about the migration in some countries, for example in Thailand. Many of the refugee and asylum seekers were detained in detention facilities because when they are like the illegal migration and have overstay, have no visa, so it's criminalized in Thailand, in many countries. This is very important that how can we amend the law so that we can be friends with everybody. And in the global, I think we need some, not only the political will, but also to make people understanding about how can we respect to the dignity and value of all people, not only regarding to their race, sex, or whatever.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a good question when we look at funding and funding relationships. I don't think anybody is strongly against humanitarian support if it's genuinely reaching local populations going in whatever the context. I think the bigger question is around development funding. And if we look at the Sustainable Development Goals that talk about the importance of an enabling environment for civil society, if we look at the indicators on development effectiveness that talk about partnership, transparency, accountability, then those can only be achieved where human rights defenders, where local people have voice, are able to organize, are able to speak out. So when governments bring in restrictive legislation on civil society, donors that are funding development projects in partnership with the government need to have pause. We wouldn't call for cutting off funding in all circumstances, but they need to have pause because it's going against what they've signed up to in the Sustainable Development Goals, and there has to be consequences when governments take action against civil society within the development framework, within the context of the SDGs, particularly SDG 16 on governance that has specific clauses about monitoring attacks on human rights defenders and journalists. So I think that's a big debate, and it's part of how we need to have a more joined up discussion that includes people working in development, the environment, as well as human rights, and how we address some of these issues. Briefly, I also wanted to say that the restrictive legislation and the use of terrorism or other security charges against human rights defenders is the most common thing that we see globally against human rights defenders, and it's something that many human rights defenders in many parts of the world are facing, and we need the international community to be a little bit stronger in standing up to that, because I think sometimes governments and international mechanisms are a little bit wary of taking up people who are accused of being terrorists or accused on no grounds of advocating violence. And we need to be more robust in how we do that. And just briefly also to say, I think I'll leave Bruno to answer the question on the legal situation terms of migration. But what we are seeing as well is criminalization of those working to support and provide humanitarian assistance to those who are attempting to cross boundaries. And we're also seeing the hate speech and repressive legislation and the mobilization of populist groups against those who are defending the rights of migrants, of refugees, asylum seekers, who are promoting pluralism in a number of countries. And it's obviously particularly worrying what's happening in Hungary at the moment.
So just 30 seconds, I'll just add on the issue of using the label of terrorism. I do think Western countries have to take a look at themselves about how that label has served other countries using it and then overusing it and exploiting it in a way to go after anyone who's labeled terrorist. And I think Western countries and their fixation on this issue and on the war against terrorism have contributed to some extent to that. Bruno.
Absolutely. On that vein, terrorism has been probably the biggest handout that the West has provided to all types of autocrats. Think of Sisi in Egypt. On the guise of terrorism, he has basically been able to shut down anything that is contrary to the Sisi regime. You're demonized as a Muslim Brotherhood member just because you want to somehow oppose any decision, any action taken by the government. So we really need to, while obviously keeping the radar clearly on sight in terms of, yes, there is a terrorist threat, that the overarching legislations that have been basically adopted in the West and beyond have provided a perfect excuse for people to basically clamp down on civil society. I'm very glad you brought the issue of Cameroon, and I think it basically is one of the tests, one of these canaries in the tunnel that show us that we are failing in our duty to do early warning and prevention, where all of the warning signs were available. Where there were sufficient levers on President Biya to somehow address the situation differently from how it's being addressed. And we hear a lot, especially since the UN Secretary General was here, talking about the importance he gives to early warning and prevention. Well, he certainly has a role to play. As I mentioned, Article 99 gives him the authority to do so. But I think we also should not exonerate some of the African institutions, because some of the comments I've heard from some of our partners here coming either from Congo or from Cameroon is basically faulting the UN, the international community in the abstract. But at times when the international community has tried to address situations in Africa, very often what they find is this collective response about African solutions to African problems. And you see it day in and day out in the General Assembly, in the Human Rights Council, where you actually have competing resolutions at times presented by the European Union, for example, on Burundi, and then you have an African group resolution which basically exonerates President Nkurunziza. Same thing on the Democratic Republic of Congo, an EU resolution which would basically tackle President Kabila, and you have an African group joint resolution which basically says exonerates President Kabila of everything. So there's a lot of responsibility to go around, and what we need is actually people like you to speak out, the civil society to speak out, so that we can have larger accountability. On the issue of jus cogens, I get your point, but unfortunately I don't think this is the moment for us to build new law, or at least what we're trying to do is defend what we have. The geopolitical moment we're living is not one for many new conventions and treaties. We obviously would like to see more on complementary protection to migrants and refugees especially. But here, once again, I think we all recognize how limited the protections provided by the Refugee Convention are, in light of the fact that it was designed for a world that is no longer with us. And many of the people that we would like to see benefiting from complementary protection cannot, because of the very restrictive definition given to refugees. But I understand your point about how you might not have liked the way that the migrant and the refugee issue is being proposed or dealt with today. We're not living any longer a migrant crisis. The numbers have fallen dramatically. What we have, however, in 2018 is the highest level of deaths in the central Mediterranean, notwithstanding the lowest crossings on record. So this is basically something that has reached the highest levels of political imagination, because people are instrumentalizing, demonizing, and scaremongering and using the refugees as a political tool. instead of looking into their own obligations in terms of delivering asylum and refugee protection. But I'm happy to continue the conversation on this side.
Okay, we only have about 5 or 6 minutes to go, so I'll take 3 questions. I don't think I'll get everyone. See, somebody is very eager to speak, but I have to go through the numbers. I'm sorry. So I have number 4, 3, I don't know where that is, 8, and then I think we're going to have to close unless, I don't know if it was because is he number 1? Okay, so why don't we go, but very quickly, very quick questions, very quick answers, 4, 3, 8, and then now I can't remember that number, 1 and 8. Okay.
Okay, thank you. My name is Carlos Rito. I serve as the Executive Secretary for Brazilian Climate Observatory. Brazil is the country that kills more environmentalists worldwide, and also land rights movements. And right now we are going through a significant change, a new government coming into power, the hate speech, and we are running the risk to see anti-terrorism legislation changing to include land movements as terrorists. And my question is very brief, and what's the strongest message that should come from the international community to prevent things to go really bad before this government comes to power in the beginning of the year, and who should be the messenger? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you, Chair, for giving me the opportunity to ask the question. Since I'm coming from Beijing, where I'm based, and lots of issues we work back in China. One of them is human rights education. And I do have a European face here. And in the ways that I work in Europe, I have an office in The Hague. So I work in 2 very different worlds. That's my background. My question is that in my work, lots of the challenges I have is to persuade people a country-specific human rights situation is a threat to peace in general, globally. Say, because again, coming from a very different context from our African brothers, that in a very big country, say Russia, putting away hypothetically 1 million of its own citizens in camps for national security reasons, how is that a threat to global peace since we're in the Paris Peace Forum?
Thank you. Please.
Bonjour et merci beaucoup, Claude Tamba. Moi, je voudrais juste d'abord poser la question à vous qui êtes là, parce que vous êtes des experts, à ce que je sache. Mais maintenant, j'ai participé à beaucoup de conférences. Déjà, on n'a pas beaucoup de temps, on nous presse. Et là, c'est très important ce qu'on est en train de faire là. Et vous, vous êtes des experts. On peut vous voir sur Internet, on peut vous voir partout. On a besoin de gens qui doivent prendre des décisions, qui doivent nous écouter, comme tous ceux qui ont parlé avant moi. Parce que on se rejette la responsabilité. Je voudrais savoir, est-ce qu'il n'y a pas moyen de faire, par exemple, le football, qui est un sport public, qu'on interdise l'organisation à des compétitions, à des États qui ne respectent pas les droits de l'homme, par exemple le Qatar et la Russie qui vient d'organiser, c'est des pays qui ne respectent pas les droits de l'homme. Il faut qu'il y ait quelque chose qui doit marquer, sinon on va parler 107 ans, il y aura pas, c'est la même chose, et ça s'appelle de la folie. Parce que la folie, c'est répondre la même chose, s'attendre à d'autres résultats. Donc je voudrais savoir, est-ce qu'il n'y a pas moyen, soit vous êtes du côté de l'humain, parce que là on représente l'humain carrément, vous êtes du côté de l'humain, le football, tout le monde, pauvre, riche, on regarde tous les matchs, on regarde tous la Coupe du Monde. Est-ce qu'il n'y a pas moyen de transmettre, d'imposer, parce que ce n'est pas à négocier les droits de l'homme. Parce que ça ramène quoi? L'immigration, qui est une conséquence dont les gens ne parlent pas, et la cause, c'est la France, par exemple, qui organise ce forum, malheureusement fait partie de la cause, parce que les armes vendues en Afrique ou ailleurs, c'est ces armes-là qui se retournent contre les peuples. Et on ne comprend pas, moi je ne comprends pas. Et vous poussez aujourd'hui, quand on dit la gouvernance, ces gens-là sont votés dans des pays comme la France, dans tous les pays d'Europe, c'est la démocratie. Les peuples on n'a pas de frontières, on n'a pas de problème avec le peuple français, le peuple américain. C'est nos dirigeants qui sont les premiers diviseurs. Parce que quand ils viennent là, ils sont élus par le peuple et ils sont là pour les industries.
Merci. Mais merci beaucoup pour votre question. Very last question, very brief, please.
Yes, I'm going to keep it brief. My name is Ariel Benson, and I'm Secretary General of an organization for young people called JCI. And I want to take this conversation to the future because I think we've spent a lot of time talking about the status quo. But what about the future? and I say this because of the changing times that we live in. We know that governments and instruments have worked to a certain extent. But as we look at the future and we see that citizens are going to have more responsibility and become more powerful, how do we look to the future? Because the Human Rights Declaration is not a law. It is a set of values that we humans agree to. But how do we see the future where we ensure that beyond the man-made boundaries, we can begin to see how citizens, individuals, organizations, businesses play a more vital role in ensuring that every citizen's rights are protected?
Thank you so much. So very briefly, unfortunately, maybe 30 seconds or so per person, if you want to, any concluding remarks, any answers, obviously, you can give. If you could start, please.
I will say very briefly. I think we have gone so far for the since we have the Human Rights Declaration, and all the nations still face the same problems. Migration, refugees, and when we talk about human rights defenders, I think it's easy to say that it's the state's accountability, but in reality, it's really difficult. But how can the international community, I think international communities also have a big role to not only to like sanction, but international communities have to support all the states to protect their own citizens. And one thing that I think is important is that I think we have to empower the people. We have to empower the human rights defenders and the affected communities. How can they organize? How can they have the network? And how can they work together? I think this is very important as well.
Thank you. Very briefly.
Very briefly, in terms of Brazil, I think we need to focus on killings of human rights defenders, both in the urban area and in the rural areas. We need to look at those who are funding some of the projects in the rural areas where people are being killed. And I think we need to look to the future as well. And I think the future is positive because I think we see more and more young people engaged in the struggle for human rights, and that's good for us.
I'm very... Okay.
Within the new technologies area for a group photograph. Thank you.
Okay. I think we have to end unless there's something very brief. I want to invite all of you to stay here because we're going to now have a sustainable development fashion show. Okay. So please stay for that. It's organized by the late Kofi Annan's daughter. In the meantime, you could please give a hand to our panelists and thank you for your participation.
Hehehehe